In the 1890s, in a cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio, a man ordered the bodies of his own dead children dug up from the family burial plot. He was not acting in confusion or in haste. He was not in the grip of grief in any ordinary sense of that word. He was acting with complete deliberation, with the kind of cold and purposeful clarity that only arrives after years of accumulated grievance have finally found a form precise enough to contain them. And he had waited a long time for this particular form to present itself. The reason was simple, and once you understand the full history of what had passed between these two men, entirely in keeping with everything that had come before it, his brother, the richest man in America, the richest man in the history of the United States, had placed a monument on the Rockefeller family plot at Lakeview Cemetery. An obelisk, reportedly 71 feet tall, carved from pale stone, carrying the family name in letters large enough to be read from a considerable distance across the open grounds of the cemetery. A monument to the name, a monument to the legacy, a monument, in the most literal and physical sense, to John D. Rockefeller's permanent occupation of the ground beneath it, and Franklin Rockefeller, known to everyone who had ever known him simply as Frank, would not allow the bodies of his own dead children to remain in earth that his brother controlled. He said so plainly in a statement that was reported in the press at the time, and that has survived in the historical record, because it was too striking to be forgotten. "Not one of my blood," he declared, "will ever rest upon land controlled by that monster, John D. Rockefeller." That word, monster, applied to the man the world had decided was the greatest industrialist in the history of the United States of America, the founder of Standard Oil, the architect of the first great American business trust, the man whose personal fortune at its peak was so large that careful historical analysis places it somewhere between $300 and $400 billion in present-day terms, a sum so large that it requires a moment of stillness before it can even be approached as a concept rather than simply as a number. The man who gave away $500 million during his own lifetime, who funded universities, who ran campaigns that eradicated diseases from the American South, who built institutions that continue to operate and to shape the world a full century after his death. The man who is still considered, by most serious historical measures, the wealthiest private individual this country has ever produced. That man, monster. This is not at its heart a story about oil, though oil is present in every corner of it. It is not a story about money, though the scale of the money involved is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. It is not even in the end a story about business or about power, though both of those things are central to everything that happens. At its core, this is a story about two brothers who grew up in the same house, who were raised by the same impossible father, who absorbed the same lessons from the same chaotic and damaged childhood, and who turned out to be entirely different kinds of men in ways that neither of them could have predicted, and neither of them could change. One of them built the largest private fortune in the history of the United States. The other spent the better part of 40 years trying to escape the shadow of that fortune, testifying against his brother before congressional committees, denouncing him by name in the national press, moving the bodies of his dead children from a cemetery plot, and ultimately dying in a Cleveland hotel room, having taken the precaution, while he still had the strength to take precautions, of dictating a formal statement to reporters, making absolutely certain that his famous brother could not come near him even as he lay dying. The story of what happened between these two men and why and what it cost both of them is one of the strangest and most illuminating stories in the history of American wealth. It reveals something about what total control costs the person who achieves it, and something about what it does to the people who are close enough to that person to feel the force of it without benefiting from its rewards. It starts not with John and not with Standard Oil and not with the obelisk in the cemetery. It starts with a family that could barely hold itself together, and with two boys who grew up in exactly the same house and turned out to be, in the ways that mattered most, entirely different people. Before we go any further, if you are joining this channel for the first time, welcome. Drop your location in the comments below. We genuinely love knowing where in the world our audience is watching from. and the answers are always more surprising than you might expect. And if you find stories like this one worth your time, subscribing takes 1 second and makes sure you never miss another. Now, to understand what Frank Rockefeller was really doing in that cemetery, and what had been building between these two brothers for decades before it, you have to go back to the very beginning of this family. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, on a modest farm near the small town of Richford in upstate New York, roughly midway between the cities of Binghamton and Ithaca. It was not a prosperous setting, it was not a stable one. It was a farm in a rural part of a young country, and the family that occupied it was already more complicated than its surroundings would suggest. He was the second of 6 children. His elder sister was Lucy. His younger siblings were William Jr., Mary, and the fraternal twins Franklin and Frances. Of the twins, only Franklin survived infancy. His sister Frances died young before she could become a real presence in any of her siblings' lives, leaving Frank as the youngest surviving child in a household that was already considerably more complicated than it appeared from the outside. The complication had a name: William Avery Rockefeller, known locally as Big Bill, and by those who knew him well enough to dispense with courtesy, as Devil Bill. He was a large man, physically imposing, with a personality that could fill a room and a moral framework that was, to put it directly, non-existent. He made his living by traveling from town to town across the northeastern and midwestern United States, presenting himself as a botanic physician, selling patent elixirs that he claimed could cure cancer, rheumatism, and a variety of other ailments that the 19th century rural population was vulnerable to, and that genuine medicine had not yet found reliable ways to treat. His prices were not modest. He charged as much as $25 per treatment for medicines that treated nothing, that contained nothing therapeutic, that were effective only in the sense that they were consistently purchased by people desperate enough to believe that something purchased at that price must be worth having. He was a con artist, not in the casual sense of someone who occasionally shaded the truth in a negotiation, but in the professional and dedicated sense of someone who had organized his entire working life around the systematic deception of strangers for money. He was also, as the world would eventually and publicly discover, a bigamist who maintained 2 complete families simultaneously for decades, without either family knowing the full truth of the situation. He had been suspected of horse stealing in his younger years. He had been formally indicted for rape in 1849, an accusation that was never resolved cleanly in the public record, but that followed the family name through subsequent decades. He kept his money not in any bank, but in large rolls of cash that he carried in his pockets at all times, and when he returned from his extended journeys on the road, he would spread his earnings in front of his children, letting them see what he had accumulated, making the money itself into a kind of education. He was also, in his peculiar way, deliberate about what he was teaching them. He admitted to a neighbor without apparent embarrassment that he did business deals with his sons and always tried to cheat them because he wanted to make them sharp. He lent money to his children at prevailing market interest rates. He called in those loans without warning, specifically to test whether the borrower had been careful enough to maintain sufficient reserves to repay without distress. He believed that the world was a place that would take from you whatever you were not disciplined and calculating enough to protect, and he was transmitting that belief to his children through the only method he fully trusted, which was practical demonstration. His absences from the family home were sometimes weeks long and sometimes months long. The money came when he returned, along with the disruption of his presence and the particular tension that settled over a household when a man everyone had learned to manage without was suddenly in the middle of it again. And then he would leave, and the family would resume its ordinary operations under the management of Eliza, and the cycle would begin again. The family moved constantly during John's childhood, driven partly by Bill's preference for keeping one step ahead of the consequences of his various enterprises, and partly by the simple fact that his behavior in any given community had a way of accumulating past the point where staying was comfortable. From Richford to Moravia, New York, when John was 4, from Moravia to Owego in Tioga County in 1851, when John was 12, from Owego to Strongsville, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, in 1853, when John was 14. 6 children and a mother learning a new city, a new school, new neighbors, new church, in a pattern that gave nothing time to become permanent and made stability itself into a concept that required active construction rather than something that simply existed and could be relied upon. Against the chaos of Bill, John's mother Eliza was the structure that kept everything standing. She was of Scots-Irish descent, the daughter of a farmer named John Davison, after whom her eldest son had been named, and she was devoutly Baptist in a way that organized her entire understanding of what a life was for. She was not simply religious in the attending services sense. She was religious in the every decision is a moral decision sense, in the sense that shapes children rather than just informing them. She taught her children three things above all others: how to work, how to save, and how to give. She managed the household during Bill's absences with a discipline and a moral seriousness that the external world never fully saw and that her children never forgot. She was the reason John kept a ledger from his first paycheck. She was the reason he donated to church before he donated to anything else. She was the reason he was, as an adult, both ruthlessly effective in business and genuinely committed to giving money away, because she had taught him that these two things belong together rather than in opposition. John was a serious boy, reserved, earnest, precise. His contemporaries at school remembered him less for brilliance than for thoroughness, for a quality of attention to detail that distinguished him from his peers in a way that was visible even in childhood. He excelled at mathematics and at debate. He had a deep love of music and entertained the idea briefly that music might be a career worth pursuing. His mother's practicality eventually settled that question. He planned to attend college after graduating from Central High School in Cleveland, the first public high school west of the Alleghenies, where the family had enrolled him when they arrived in the city. His father's financial pressure prevented it. Under Bill's influence, John dropped out of high school 2 months before graduation, took a 10-week business course at Folsom's Commercial College, where he studied bookkeeping, penmanship, banking, and commercial law, and began looking for work in the city. He said later that he did not go to any small establishments. He was after something big. He found a position as an assistant bookkeeper at a produce commission firm called Kyquit and Tuttle. He was 16 years old. He would celebrate the anniversary of that hiring, September 26, 1855, every year for the rest of his life. He called it Job Day and treated it as the day his real existence had begun, the day the life he was going to build had become a possibility rather than an ambition. He said that he often trembled when he asked himself what would have happened if he had not gotten that job. Frank, born 6 years after John, grew up in the same household and emerged from it as an almost entirely different person. The same boisterousness that would eventually lead him to enlist in an army while still underage, to fight through some of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War and sustain 2 wounds doing it, and later to spend $5,050 on a prize bull for a Kansas cattle ranch, was visible in him from childhood. Where John absorbed their mother's discipline and turned it into a system for managing the world, Frank absorbed their father's energy and impetuousness without the cold calculation that made those qualities useful rather than simply dangerous. He was not reckless in the way that gets people killed early. He was reckless in the way that gets people into situations they cannot fully manage, that cost more than expected, and that require rescue from the people around them who possess the discipline the reckless person lacks. The 2 boys were not enemies in childhood. They were simply built differently, in ways that the world had not yet given them occasion to discover were incompatible. On September 26, 1855, John D. Rockefeller walked into the offices of Kyquit and Tuttle, a produce commission firm in Cleveland that bought and sold hay, grain, meats, and various other goods on commission, and began what would become the most consequential commercial career in American history. He was paid approximately 50 cents a day. He reviewed every bill that came through the office. He identified discrepancies of even a few pennies. He was, by the accounts of everyone who worked alongside him in those early years, thorough in a way that suggested not merely diligence, but something closer to genuine passion for the precision of it. A real pleasure in the orderly management of numbers and accounts that was not something he performed, but something that reflected how his mind actually worked. He began keeping a personal ledger from his first paycheck. Every expenditure was recorded, Every charitable donation was recorded: contributions to church, gifts to a poor girl he passed on the street, donations to abolitionist causes, the cost of a meal, the interest on a debt. Nothing was too small to be noted. He later said that he would not trade his first ledger for all the riches in the world, because it had been the foundation on which everything else was built. The discipline of knowing exactly where money came from and exactly where it went was not, for John, a burden or a constraint. It was the closest thing he had to emotional security in a childhood that had offered very little of that commodity. By 1859, 4 years of careful saving and careful work had left him with $800 of his own, enough to approach his father for a loan. Bill lent him $1,000 at 10% interest, with the same commercial terms he would have applied to a business transaction with a stranger. The combined sum of $1,800, together with $2,000 contributed by a neighbor named Morris B. Clark, gave them the $4,000 in initial capital they needed to form Clark and Rockefeller, commission merchants dealing in hay, grain, meats, and miscellaneous goods. In their first year of business, the firm grossed approximately $450,000 and returned a profit of $4,400. In the second year, profit rose to $17,000. They were growing, and John was already borrowing against future earnings to accelerate the growth beyond what their current capital would naturally support, a practice that made his partner profoundly uncomfortable and that John found entirely natural, because the numbers told him it was right, and the numbers were what he trusted. The oil fields of western Pennsylvania had been opened in 1859 with the drilling of the first commercial well near Titusville, and the petroleum industry that emerged from that discovery was transforming the industrial landscape of the northeastern United States with a speed that made every other development of the era seem gradual by comparison. Cleveland sat within practical reach of the oil regions and had rail connections that gave it transportation advantages over rival cities like Pittsburgh. The demand for kerosene refined from crude petroleum was growing rapidly as it displaced whale oil as the primary source of artificial illumination in American homes and businesses. The profit margins on refined kerosene were substantial, even after the volatility of the crude oil market was accounted for, and the technical barriers to entering the refining business were not prohibitive. Capital requirements for a basic refinery were modest. The real advantage would go to whoever brought sufficient scale, sufficient efficiency, and sufficient control over the supply chain to dominate what everyone could see was going to be an enormous industry. John recognized this. In 1863, he and Clark partnered with a chemist named Samuel Andrews, who had technical knowledge of the refining process, to build an oil refinery in the industrial district of Cleveland known as the Flats. The investment was treated initially as a side venture alongside the commission business, but John understood from early in the partnership that the commission business was a means and the oil refinery was the destination. He began methodically building the advantages that would eventually make Standard Oil invincible. He hired his own workers to manufacture barrels, reducing the cost from approximately $3 per barrel to under $1.50. He retained chemists to find commercial applications for the waste products that other refiners were dumping into the Cuyahoga River, products that turned out to have value as lubricating oil, petroleum jelly, paraffin wax, and various other marketable goods. He built his own drayage operation to control transportation costs within Cleveland. He manufactured his own sulfuric acid, used in the refining process, and developed technology to recover and reuse it rather than purchasing it fresh for each production cycle. His relationship with the Clark brothers deteriorated through 1863 and 1864. Maurice's brother James, who had been brought into the partnership, had been a prizefighter before entering business and had a habit of bragging openly about schemes he had run in the oil fields, and John had concluded with characteristic precision that this was exactly the kind of man who would eventually run a scheme on his own business partners. The philosophical disagreement between them was genuine and impossible to paper over. The Clarks wanted to operate on cash, limit borrowing, and treat the oil business as a temporary windfall to be exploited and pocketed. John wanted to borrow heavily against the future, reinvest every dollar of profit into the operation, and build something so large and so efficient that it could not be threatened by any single fluctuation in the price of crude oil or the cost of transportation. In February of 1865, He forced the issue by calling for a vote to dissolve the partnership and sell the refinery at auction to whoever bid highest. The bidding went back and forth in a tense exchange until John acquired the business for $72,500, paying for it with borrowed money and with the absolute certainty that the investment would return far more than it cost. He later called that day the day that determined his career. He was 25 years old, and he owned the largest oil refinery in Cleveland. He began borrowing immediately. He reinvested everything. He had his system, and now he had the platform to run it at the scale it required. The war came in 1861, and it divided the Rockefeller brothers in a way that nothing in their shared childhood had managed to do. Frank Rockefeller was 16 years old and still legally underage when he enlisted in the Union Army in September of 1861. He joined Company A of the 7th Ohio Infantry, and what followed was not a brief or sheltered experience of military service. Frank fought in engagements that included the battles of Winchester, Port Republic, Cedar Mountain, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Lookout Mountain, among others. He was present for some of the most brutal and costly fighting of the entire conflict. The Battle of Chancellorsville alone, fought in May of 1863, produced Union casualties of approximately 17,000 men killed, wounded, or captured over 4 days of combat. Gettysburg, 2 months later, produced approximately 23,000 Union casualties over 3 days. These were not peripheral skirmishes. Frank Rockefeller was a teenager fighting through the center of the war, in engagements whose names became permanent markers of how much the conflict cost the country that was conducting it. He sustained 2 wounds during his service. The second wound was serious enough to end his military career, though it did not end his life. He came home to Cleveland a veteran, physically marked by what had happened to him, carrying the particular knowledge that only accumulates in people who have been in places where survival was not guaranteed and where the men beside them did not always share it. He came home changed in the way that combat changes people, with a different sense of what was owed between human beings and what could reasonably be withheld. Before Frank left for the front, he asked John for a loan. He needed $75 to purchase the military equipment required for his service. John refused him. John D. Rockefeller did not enlist. He was opposed to slavery and had voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and he later said that he wanted to go into the Army and do his part, but that it was simply out of the question because there was no one to take his place and too many people depended on the business he was building. When the Enrollment Act of 1863 made the draft a reality, he paid a substitute $300 to serve in his place, a practice that was entirely legal under the terms of the legislation, and that was used by a significant number of men who had the financial means to avail themselves of it. The amount he refused his brother was $75. The amount he paid for his own way out of the same war was $300. The gap between those two numbers is not large in absolute terms. It is immense in terms of what it reveals about how John D. Rockefeller made his calculations, and about what kind of calculations he was making, and about who and what he included in the accounting. Frank went to the war without the equipment John had refused to help him buy. He fought at Chancellorsville and at Gettysburg and at Lookout Mountain, carrying whatever he could provide for himself, and he came home wounded. John stayed in Cleveland and built the platform from which he would eventually control 90% of the oil refined in the United States. When Frank returned from the war and tried to find his footing in a peacetime city, the commercial world he was returning to had been substantially reshaped by the brother who had not gone. The Cleveland John had been building while Frank was fighting was not the same Cleveland Frank had left. The distance between the two brothers, measured in experience and in financial standing, and in the specific weight of having been refused by a person who had the means to help and chose not to, had grown in the years Frank was away into something that would never fully close. This is the foundation of everything that follows. Every congressional testimony, every press denunciation, every act of public hostility, every moment of the feud that would last for the rest of Frank's life builds on this foundation. The Civil War is where the math between them became impossible to reconcile. Frank came home from the war with 2 wounds and a brother who had not been there, and who had made sure in the most financially precise way imaginable that he would not have to be. That fact sat between them for 56 years. It never moved. While Frank was finding his footing in a peacetime Cleveland, John had not been idle. The oil industry that John entered in the 1860s was not an industry in any organized sense of the word. It was a landscape of improvised extraction and chaotic refining spread across the oil regions of western Pennsylvania and the refining cities of the Northeast, operating under price swings so violent that the commodity could drop from $20 a barrel to 10 cents a barrel in a matter of months and rise again with equal unpredictability. Total refining capacity in the industry had, by 1870, grown to approximately 3 times the amount of crude oil actually being pumped from the ground. The market was glutted with refined kerosene that cost more to produce than it could be sold for at current prices. Approximately 90% of all refineries in the country were, by John's own estimate, operating at a loss. Most of the people in this industry looked at this situation and saw crisis. John D. Rockefeller looked at it and saw exactly the conditions required for what he intended to do. In 1866, 1 year after buying out the Clark brothers, John brought his brother William into the business as a full partner, and they built a second refinery in Cleveland, which they named the Standard Works. In 1867, Henry Morrison Flagler joined the partnership. Flagler brought railroad connections that would prove in the years ahead to be more valuable than any single piece of refining equipment John could have purchased. The firm became Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. By 1868, the company owned 2 major Cleveland refineries and a marketing subsidiary in New York City, and had become the largest oil refinery operation in the world by volume. In that same year, John approached the Lakeshore Railroad with a proposal that would define his competitive strategy going forward. He guaranteed the railroad 60 carloads of oil shipments daily, a volume commitment so large that the railroad could plan its operations around it. In exchange, he received a shipping discount of approximately 71% below the posted rate. His competitors paid the posted rate in full. He paid a fraction of it. The difference between what it cost Standard Oil to move a barrel of refined kerosene and what it cost any independent competitor to move the same barrel was not a minor advantage. It was a structural elimination of the conditions under which competition could exist. On January 10, 1870, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was formally incorporated with $1 million in capital. John held 30% of the 10,000 shares issued. His brother William held approximately 13%. Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, and a small number of other partners divided the remaining shares among themselves. Frank held no founding stake. He was present in the background of the enterprise, connected to it through his family relationship and through a nominal vice presidency that would eventually be formalized, coming with a salary and a title but with no real power over any decision the company made. He was not at the table where Standard Oil was born. The man who had fought at Gettysburg did not hold shares in what that absence had allowed his brother to build. Between February 17th and March 28th of 1872, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of its 26 Cleveland competitors. The period became known as the Cleveland Massacre, and the name has persisted in the historical record because it captures something true about the nature and the pace of what occurred. In approximately 6 weeks, the refining industry of the most significant oil refining city in the United States was reorganized around a single controlling entity, and that entity was Standard Oil. The mechanics were not hidden. John would request a meeting with the owner of a competing refinery. He would bring his ledgers, which made the situation unmistakably clear. Standard Oil could ship oil at a fraction of the cost any independent could achieve because Standard Oil had arrangements with the railroads that no independent could replicate. The competing refinery owner could accept an offer paid in cash or in Standard Oil shares at John's stated price and become either a cash recipient or a Standard Oil shareholder. Or the competing refinery owner could decline, attempt to continue operations, and discover that the Cleveland banks had already been offered the opportunity to purchase Standard Oil stock and had accordingly developed a limited appetite for extending credit to businesses competing against it. The choice was presented in John's famously quiet voice, soft and unemotional and absolutely clear about what the options were and what each of them meant. Several refinery owners later described being told, in nearly identical terms, that Standard Oil had a combination with the railroads and was going to buy out all the refiners in Cleveland. and that those who refused to sell would be crushed. Frank himself later testified about this before a congressional committee, describing specific instances and naming specific figures. He told reporters that approximately 20 Cleveland men had sold out in fright, and that almost any of them would have confirmed the account of how those conversations had proceeded. Frank had married Helen Elizabeth Schofield in 1870. Helen's father was William Schofield, a partner in the Cleveland refinery firm of Alexander Schofield and Company. Alexander Schofield and Company was among the refineries absorbed during the Cleveland Massacre. Frank's father-in-law sold out during the consolidation, his family's business consumed by the same system that was consuming every other independent refiner in the city. Frank did not stay quiet about it. He testified before a congressional committee about John's tactics in the acquisition of Alexander, Schofield specifically, and in the broader consolidation of Cleveland refineries generally. He went on the record. He named specific methods. He described specific threats. He attached his own name, the Rockefeller name, to a public account of what his brother had done. He also co-founded the Pioneer Oil Works in 1870 as an independent rival to Standard Oil. It was eventually acquired by Standard Oil, absorbed into the same consolidation that had absorbed Alexander Schofield, that had absorbed 22 of the 26 Cleveland refineries. That was in the process of absorbing the entire American oil industry. Standard Oil continued to expand after Cleveland. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, the Pennsylvania oil regions. The refining capacity of city after city brought under the control of the trust that John and his partners had created. By January of 1881, the Standard Oil Trust was formally established, with the stock of all affiliated companies placed under the control of a board of 9 trustees with John at the head. It was the first major American business trust, and it became the organizational template for every monopolistic combination that followed it in the Gilded Age. By 1882, Standard Oil's control of American oil refining was effectively total. The man who had grown up in a household his father visited when he felt like it, who had borrowed $1,000 at 10% interest to start his first business, had built something that had no precedent in the commercial history of the country. The contrast between the brothers' trajectories by this point could not have been more complete. By the middle of the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller was the dominant figure in the American economy, and one of the most recognized men in the world. He was also increasingly the subject of a public resentment that was growing toward the scale of something political, rather than merely commercial. His private life presented a studied contrast to the public image. He had married Laura Celestia Spellman in 1864, the daughter of a family whose abolitionist convictions were not rhetorical but operational. The Spellmans had been active supporters of the Underground Railroad, people who had put their practical resources toward causes they believed in, and Laura carried that same quality of genuine commitment into her marriage and into her influence on where John's philanthropic attention eventually went. She championed his support of Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary, the institution that became Spelman College, named for her family, one of the most significant historically black colleges in the United States. She was a serious woman, principled and committed, and her presence in John's life was one of the few contexts in which the gap between his stated values and his business practices was regularly brought to his attention, rather than being managed around. His personal habits were a demonstration of the discipline his mother had installed in him. He woke at 7 every morning and retired at 9 every evening. He attended Baptist services every Sunday without exception, seeking out African American Baptist congregations when he traveled and leaving substantial donations at each one. He taught Sunday school into old age. He distributed dimes to children he encountered on the street, a practice so consistent across so many decades that it became simultaneously a genuine expression of generosity and something that the public recognized as a kind of performance. A carefully maintained image of the benevolent patriarch dispensing small but regular kindnesses to the world below him. He believed, in a way that appeared entirely genuine, that God had given him his particular capacity for accumulating wealth as a form of trust, and that he was obligated to return it to the world in the most useful way he could conceive of. He saw no contradiction, or if he saw it, he did not feel it, between this belief and the methods by which the wealth had been obtained. The $75 refused to his brother before the war. The absorbed refineries of the Cleveland Massacre. The Corrigan stock transaction that would come later. These things and the Sunday school and the dimes and the university endowments all coexisted in John D. Rockefeller without apparent cognitive dissonance. This is one of the most remarkable things about him, and one of the most difficult to fully understand from any distance. The estate at Kyquit in Pocantico Hills, Westchester County, which John began constructing around 1905 and which required 8 years and multiple revisions before it reached its final form, was an expression of what the cumulative wealth of 4 decades looked like when it was given permanent architectural form. The compound contained approximately 75 houses and 70 roads within its grounds. It featured gardens that had been designed with reference to the gardens of Versailles, bowling alleys, golf courses built to professional standards, and farms that produced their own food to provision the household throughout the year. Its permanent staff of gardeners, chefs, groundskeepers, and household workers numbered in the dozens. Its dining rooms and drawing rooms received a continuous rotation of American presidents, foreign heads of state, the leading figures of finance and industry, and the prominent men and women of whatever generation happened to be passing through the peak of their influence at any given time. It was described with a mixture of genuine awe and social vertigo that the description still produces, as what God would have built if only he had had the money. His fortune peaked at approximately $900 million in 1897, the year he formally retired from active management of Standard Oil. He was 58 years old, and he had set 2 goals for himself as a high school boy in Cleveland. The first was to make $100,000. The second was to live to be 100 years old. By the time he retired, the first goal had been exceeded by a factor so large that the arithmetic of his boyhood had no vocabulary for it. He was well advanced toward the second. Frank had spent the 1880s trying to build something entirely and genuinely his own, and by 1884, the attempt had produced losses substantial enough to require outside intervention. His investments in railroad stocks had gone badly during the overexpansion and subsequent correction of that decade. The pattern of boom, followed by inevitable contraction that characterized most speculative sectors of the 19th century economy. The losses were not trivial. By 1884, Frank's financial position had deteriorated to the point where he needed help, and the only source of help available at the scale his situation required was the family he had been publicly criticizing for years. He went to John, and John quietly provided financial support, because that is what John did with things that needed to be managed. He managed them. The dynamic this created between the two brothers was one of the more complicated features of their estrangement. Frank was publicly hostile to his brother and financially dependent on him simultaneously, and neither condition appeared to modify the other. The hostility continued, the support continued. The two things coexisted in the relationship the way they seemed to coexist in John himself without any apparent sense that they should be in tension. The arrangement continued in the background of a relationship that was, on its visible surface, becoming increasingly hostile. Frank and his business partner James Corrigan were co-owners of the Franklin Iron Mining Company in Wisconsin. Corrigan was a Cleveland businessman who had known the Rockefeller family for years, and who occupied the uncomfortable position of someone trusted by both sides of a feud that he did not fully understand until it was too late to step out of the way of it. He had pledged 2,500 shares of Standard Oil stock as security for loans he obtained from John, using assets whose value was substantial and growing. John acquired those shares at $168 per share, a price that reflected a reasonable assessment of their value at the moment of the transaction. Within 2 years, those same shares had risen to $500 each. The appreciation across the full position represented a profit to John of approximately $830,000 on a transaction that had been conducted with a man who trusted him. Corrigan sued, arguing that John had possessed knowledge of the stock's true trajectory at the time of the acquisition and had used a business partner's trust to obtain shares at a price that did not reflect their actual value. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled against Corrigan. The case was reported in the Cleveland press and attracted attention precisely because it involved the Rockefeller name and a dispute between the nation's most powerful businessman and a man who had trusted him with a significant financial asset. The legal determination was clear and final, but Frank was not making a legal argument. Frank was making a character argument, and he had been making versions of it since before the war. The Corrigan transaction was, to Frank's understanding, simply the most recent and most financially precise demonstration of a pattern that had defined his brother's relationship to the world around him for his entire adult life. It was what John did. He had done it to Frank's father-in-law. He had done it to the 20 Cleveland refiners who sold out in fright. He had done it to Corrigan. He would do it to whoever stood in front of him next, because that was the system, and John did not deviate from his system. Frank severed his formal business connections with Standard Oil in 1898. He stopped speaking to John in any meaningful way, a silence that he would maintain for the remaining 15 years or so of his life, except to issue public statements denouncing him. John continued to pay Frank's salary through the Standard Oil payroll until 1912, 14 years after the formal break. This is a fact that the historical record notes without fully explaining. John never offered a public account of why he continued the payments to a brother who had publicly called him a monster. Frank accepted the payments without acknowledging them as evidence of anything. The money moved in one direction, and the hostility moved in another, and neither disturbed the other's trajectory. Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio, is a place of considerable beauty, with wide lawns and mature trees and monuments that reflect the tastes and the means of the prominent Cleveland families who have buried their dead there since the middle of the 19th century. The Rockefeller family had a plot in the cemetery, as was expected of a family of their standing and their history in the city. In the late 1890s, John D. Rockefeller erected a monument on that plot. The obelisk was reported to stand 71 feet tall. It bore the family name. It was, in the way that large stone monuments tend to be, a statement about permanence and about possession. When Frank discovered the obelisk, he arranged for the caskets of his 2 deceased children to be exhumed from the family plot and moved to a different section of the cemetery. He issued a statement that was reported in the press at the time and has survived in the historical record, because it was too extreme and too precise to be forgotten. Not one of my blood will ever rest upon land controlled by that monster, John D. Rockefeller. He moved the bodies of his own dead children. This is not a rhetorical flourish or an exaggeration for effect. He ordered the physical exhumation and relocation of his children's remains because he could not tolerate their proximity to his brother's monument. It is one of the most striking acts of familial hostility in the entire historical record of American wealth, and it was performed in the late 1890s by a man who had been building toward it, in one way or another, since the morning he left for the Civil War, without the $75 his brother had refused to lend him. In approximately 1900, Frank invested the remaining available capital from his various and largely unsuccessful business ventures into a cattle ranch near Belvidere, Kansas, west of Wichita, on a large tract of open plains land that his father had originally identified during one of his westward journeys years earlier. The ranch, which Frank named Soldier Creek, covered 8,000 acres of Kansas grassland and was intended to be something genuinely his own, something built by Frank Rockefeller and managed by Frank Rockefeller and successful because of Frank Rockefeller's own decisions and Frank Rockefeller's own effort. With no connection to and no dependence on the name and the fortune of the brother he had chosen to regard as his enemy. The property had 15 immense barns. Frank planted 500 acres of alfalfa to provision his cattle through the winter months. He bred Hereford stock with serious attention and genuine enthusiasm, becoming convinced that the Hereford was the future of the cattle industry, that their hardiness and their meat quality made them the right choice for the kind of large-scale ranching operation he was building. He took up the cause of buffalo preservation with real conviction, believing that the near extinction of the buffalo was a wrong that deserved direct response from people who had the means to respond to it. In 1900, he was elected president of the Hereford Breeders Association, a recognition that he had arrived as a serious figure in the industry, rather than simply a wealthy man playing at it. The following year, the Wichita Daily Eagle called Soldier Creek an earthly paradise. Frank told reporters that the happiest moments of his life had been spent on that ranch. He meant it. The evidence of how much he spent on the operation, including $5,050 for a single prize bull, makes clear that he was not treating this as a casual investment, But the ranch had heat, running water, and a tennis court. Frank could call himself a rancher and mean it sincerely, and the ranch could still have been built by a man who had never needed to worry about where his seed capital was coming from. Both of these things were true simultaneously. He hated being described as John D. Rockefeller's brother. He hated it when the ranch was described as a plaything. And yet the $5,000 bull and the tennis court were there regardless of how Frank chose to describe them, and the reporters who covered his statements about wanting to live like a simple homesteader were the same reporters who noted the amenities that distinguished Soldier Creek from any actual homestead. He told the press that John was the most lonesome man on the face of the earth, that his brother was living in a regular hell of his own construction, that he was a monster, merciless in greed and pitiless in cold, inhuman passions. These statements appeared in newspapers and were reported widely and were never retracted or qualified in any way. Frank was not performing for the press. He was settling accounts, doing in public what he had been doing privately since before the Cleveland Massacre, since before the war, since the morning he asked for $75 and was refused. He was also not entirely wrong about the hell. While Frank was building his ranch and denouncing his brother in the Kansas press, John was discovering what it actually cost to be the most powerful private individual in the history of the United States. The pressure came from a direction he had not prepared for and through a medium he had largely dismissed. Ida Tarbell was a journalist who had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil regions, the daughter of a man who had been forced out of the oil business by the South Improvement Company affair of 1872. She had heard about John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil her entire life, through the eyes of the people the company had destroyed, and she had both the skill and the motivation to document what she had heard. Beginning in 1902, she published a series of investigative articles in McClure's magazine that reconstructed Standard Oil's history in meticulous detail. Its espionage against competitors, its manipulation of railroad rates, its use of what amounted to commercial threats and commercial coercion to force independent refiners to sell or close. The series ran to many installments, was read by a vast national audience, and was collected and published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, in 1904. She later said she had been surprised by the magnitude of the public response. She had never had an animus against Standard Oil's size or wealth, she said. She had never objected to corporate combination or to companies growing large and efficient. She had only objected to the methods. They had never played fair, and that, in her judgment, had ruined their greatness. John's response to Tarbell's investigations was silence. He had always believed that results were their own argument, that the facts of what Standard Oil had done for ordinary American consumers, reducing the price of kerosene, creating reliable supply, employing tens of thousands of workers, would ultimately speak more clearly than any public defense he might mount. This was the greatest strategic error of his career. His silence was interpreted by the American public not as confidence in his record, but as contempt for the people questioning it. And contempt directed by the richest man in the country at a public already primed to distrust him was exactly the accelerant his critics needed. The physical cost of the period became visible in a way that nothing about John D. Rockefeller had ever been visible before. In his mid-50s, during the most intense years of governmental investigation and public pressure, he developed alopecia universalis, a condition that resulted in the complete loss of all body hair. His eyebrows disappeared, his mustache was gone, the hair on his head fell out entirely and did not grow back. He began wearing wigs by the early 1900s, a series of them at different lengths, adjusted periodically to give the impression of natural growth and gradual aging. The photographs from this period show a face that is eerily smooth and pale and controlled, every feature arranged in the expression of mild benevolence that he had spent decades cultivating, and yet something in the image carrying the evidence of what the years of pressure had cost him. He also suffered digestive difficulties severe enough to restrict his diet during the worst periods to near starvation levels, surviving on crackers and milk, and carefully sourced simple foods while the dining rooms of Kyquit stood prepared to serve whatever the season and the best kitchens in the country could provide. The most controlled man in America could not control his own digestion or his own hair. The empire was intact. What it had cost the man who built it was not something any ledger entry could capture or any fortune could repay. Then came the revelation about his father, which John had spent decades managing, and which Ida Tarbell's investigations had made it impossible to continue containing. In 1908, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper published a story about what it called the secret double life of Rockefeller's father. The investigation confirmed what John had known from his adolescence and had worked to keep from public knowledge throughout his adult life. His father, William Avery Rockefeller Sr., had secretly married a woman named Margaret Allen in 1855, 25 years his junior, while still legally married to John's mother, Eliza. The second wife did not discover that her marriage had no legal standing until after William's death. John and his brother William Jr. had been providing their father with quiet financial support for approximately 25 years, without disclosing to the public that he was still alive or indicating in any way where he was. One newspaper offered $8,000 to anyone who could provide information about William Avery Rockefeller's current location. John began to fear that his children might be kidnapped by parties seeking leverage against him. He had asked the minister who conducted his mother's funeral to describe Eliza as a widow. She had not been one. Her husband had been alive, living with his second family under an assumed identity, supported by the money that John and William Jr. were quietly sending him. The con man from Richford, the one who had charged $25 for cancer cures and deliberately cheated his sons to make them sharp, had lived to 96 years old, dying in 1906, outlasting his first wife, outlasting most of the century that had produced him, and outlasting the period in which the truth about him could be kept out of the newspapers. On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled under the Sherman Antitrust Act that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it dissolved into 34 separate successor companies. The government had been building toward this determination for years. Theodore Roosevelt had singled out Rockefeller as one of the malefactors of great wealth and made trust-busting a central feature of his presidency. By 1907, there were 7 separate federal suits pending against Standard Oil, with evidence that the company was more than 20 times the size of its closest competitor in the refining sector. The public pressure generated by Ida Tarbell's reporting, combined with the political momentum of the Progressive era, had finally produced a legal conclusion. By all historical accounts, John heard the news while playing golf. He reportedly turned to his companion on the course and advised him, with no apparent anxiety or distress, to buy Standard Oil stock while the price was low. The advice reflected a clear understanding of what the dissolution would actually mean for John D. Rockefeller personally. Because he was the largest individual shareholder in the original Standard Oil Company, the order to dissolve the trust into 34 separate companies meant that he received proportional shares in each of those successor enterprises. As those companies developed independently over the following years, freed from the legal and reputational burdens that had accumulated against the parent trust, many of them grew rapidly and profitably. His personal fortune actually increased in the years following the dissolution that had been designed to diminish his power. He had built his position so comprehensively at the center of the American oil economy that even the legal mechanism intended to remove him from that center operated in his financial favor. Frank's ranch declined through 1912 and 1913. The economics of large-scale cattle ranching in that part of Kansas had changed as new settlers arrived along the railroad lines, and the open range that had made the Soldier Creek property viable for grazing began to be divided and farmed. Market conditions shifted against the kind of operation Frank had built. The distance from the major cattle markets in Kansas City and Chicago, combined with the difficulty of the terrain and the operational costs of maintaining 15 barns and hundreds of head of cattle through the variable Kansas climate, made the numbers increasingly difficult to sustain. Frank returned to Cleveland, taking up residence in hotel apartments rather than any property of his own. The man who had told reporters he would rather live on a simple homestead than in John's palaces was now living in a hotel in the city that John had built into the center of the American oil industry. He told reporters in 1913 that he would still choose that simple homestead over John's way of living. The hotel went unmentioned. In his final years in Cleveland, Frank lived quietly, his public denunciations of his brother continuing, but his circumstances reduced to the kind of life that a man ends up with when most of his ventures have failed, and the fortune he drew from was never fully his to begin with. He was still Frank Rockefeller, the name still opened doors and still attracted reporters, but he was living on the margins of the world the name had built rather than anywhere near its center. In the summer of 1916, their brother William made one final effort at reconciliation between John and Frank. He approached Frank directly, asking him to let the years of estrangement go, to find some accommodation with his brother before more time passed and the accommodation became impossible. Frank refused. "There is not the slightest possibility of a reconciliation," he told reporters that year. He was 70 years old. He had been not speaking to John in any meaningful way for approximately 15 years. He had 1 year left to live. Laura Spelman Rockefeller had died in 1915, and John had largely withdrawn from Cleveland in the period following her death, the city that had been the center of his professional life becoming a place he had less reason to return to. The Forest Hill estate, the sprawling summer property in the eastern suburbs of Cleveland that John had maintained and expanded over decades, burned to the ground in 1917, destroyed by a fire that consumed the building entirely. It was not rebuilt. The physical place that had been the Rockefeller family's Cleveland home for the better part of 4 decades was gone in the same year that the last surviving Rockefeller brother of John's generation died. In February of 1917, Franklin Rockefeller entered a Cleveland hospital for surgery to address an intestinal condition that had become serious. He was 71 years old. The surgery was performed, but a fatal paralysis developed in the days that followed. The weeks between the operation and his death were weeks in which a man who had spent 50 years in active and vocal opposition to his most famous relative lay in a hospital room confronting the end of his life with the same determination he had brought to everything else. He was not reconciled. He was not softened. The approach of death did not produce in Frank Rockefeller the kind of valedictory release from grievance that people sometimes expect the dying to arrive at. What it produced was a final formal act of opposition, organized with the same deliberateness he had brought to moving his children's caskets 2 decades earlier. He was reported to have become anxious about the possibility that John might attempt to visit him. The prospect of his brother appearing at the bedside was apparently intolerable, not merely uncomfortable or unwanted, but something Frank felt the need to prevent through official action. He dictated a statement to reporters. The statement was direct and precise and left nothing ambiguous. Frank Rockefeller has not sent for his brother John and will not send for him, nor will he advise his brother of his illness. The statement was distributed to the press and published. It was issued while Frank was still alive, still in the hospital, still dying. And it carried the full weight of everything that had passed between these two men across more than 5 decades. The boy who had enlisted at 16 and been refused $75 for equipment. The man who had watched his father-in-law's refinery absorbed in the Cleveland Massacre. The man who had testified before Congress about his brother's methods. The man who had moved the bodies of his dead children. That man, in the final days of his life, used what remained of his strength and his clarity to make absolutely certain that John D. Rockefeller knew, one last time, with the full formality of a statement for the public record, exactly where he stood. Frank died on April 15, 1917. He was 71 years old. The immediate cause recorded was a stroke of paralysis, accompanied by a blood clot on the brain, a consequence of the complications that had developed following his earlier surgical procedure. His funeral was held on April 17th at the home of a family friend in Cleveland, at the residence of a woman named Mrs. Walter S. Bowler. Both John and William attended the service. Press accounts of the funeral described John as looking tired and careworn. Frank was buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. He was not placed in the Rockefeller family plot beneath the obelisk in the ground that John controlled. He was interred in a different section of the cemetery, in ground he had arranged to occupy near where the caskets of his children had been relocated nearly 2 decades earlier. He had organized every detail he could organize. He had made certain, in every way available to him over the course of his life, and then in the formal statement he issued from his hospital bed, that he would not be placed in proximity to his brother in death any more than he had been willing to stand near him in life. John D. Rockefeller outlived his brother Frank by 20 years, lacking 2 months. In the 2 decades that followed, John gave money away at a scale that remained without precedent. His total philanthropic giving reached approximately $540 million over the course of his lifetime. The University of Chicago received approximately $75 million from him by 1932 alone, funding an institution that has produced generations of scholars and Nobel laureates, and that continues to operate as one of the world's leading research universities. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, eventually renamed Rockefeller University, received $50 million from him in his lifetime and continued to generate foundational biomedical research well into the following century. His Sanitary Commission campaign against hookworm in the American South, launched in 1909, treated more than 2 million infected individuals and effectively eradicated the disease from the region by 1927, in one of the most significant public health achievements of the early 20th century. His foundation funded programs addressing yellow fever, malaria, and other diseases that had primarily afflicted the poor on a scale and with an efficiency that permanently changed what private wealth could accomplish in the service of human welfare. He spent his final years between Kyquit and the Casements in Ormond Beach, Florida, a winter residence whose name carried the quiet domesticity of a man who had built the grandest compound in American private life and had, in the end, chosen to die in something that sounded more like a family home. He played golf each day that his health permitted, with the methodical dedication he had brought to every activity since his first day at Hewitt and Tuttle. He maintained his schedule. He continued his Baptist faith and his habit of distributing dimes to children. He gave very few interviews, preferring to let the philanthropic record speak for itself in a way that the Standard Oil record had not been allowed to. His diet in his very final years was almost entirely vegetables, some of which he sourced from various parts of the world, and specially cultured milk. He had survived everything that had tried to end him. He had outlived the alopecia and the digestive illness and the Supreme Court, and Ida Tarbell, and the death of his wife, and the death of his brother. He had outlived his own father, the con man from Richford, who had cheated his sons to make them sharp, and who had lived to 96. John was going to do better than that. He had decided as a boy in Cleveland that he would live to be 100 years old, and he came within 3 years of making good on the decision. His estate at the time of his death totaled approximately $26 million. Everything else had been given away to the institutions and causes he had spent his retirement directing it toward. The fortune that had once stood at $900 million had moved through his hands and out into the world in the form of universities and hospitals and public health campaigns and foundation endowments, a dispersal of wealth so systematic and so deliberate that it looked, from a sufficient distance, almost like a final version of the ledger he had started keeping at 16. He died on May 23, 1937, of arteriosclerosis at the Casements in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old, less than 2 months short of his 98th birthday. He was buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, in the Rockefeller family plot beneath the obelisk. Frank is buried in a different section, a few hundred feet of cemetery ground, and 60 years of history lie between them. The companies that Standard Oil became are still operating today. ExxonMobil and Chevron trace their direct corporate lineage to the trust that John built and that the Supreme Court ordered dissolved. The institutions he funded continue to operate. Rockefeller University, the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation, whose programs continue in public health and agricultural development and economic opportunity across multiple continents. John Jr. donated the land on which the United Nations headquarters was built in New York City. The Rockefeller name appears on buildings, public spaces, and institutions in virtually every major American city. His descendants include Nelson Rockefeller, who served as Vice President of the United States, and Jay Rockefeller, who served as United States Senator from West Virginia for 30 years. The family fortune, distributed across foundations and trusts and approximately 150 blood relatives, continues to be a presence in American life more than 80 years after John's death. There is a version of this story in which John D. Rockefeller is simply what Frank called him, the man who refused his brother $75 while paying $300 for his own exemption from the same war. The man who absorbed his brother's father-in-law's refinery in the Cleveland Massacre. The man who acquired his brother's business partner's stock at a price that legal review found acceptable, and that Frank found unacceptable for reasons that had nothing to do with law. The man whose cemetery monument drove his brother to move the bodies of his dead children. The man who kept his brother on the payroll for 14 years after his brother had publicly called him a monster, not as an act of reconciliation, but as a form of management. Because everything John D. Rockefeller could not resolve emotionally, he managed financially instead. That version contains genuine truth. There is another version in which John D. Rockefeller was a man formed by a childhood of instability and shame, who built around himself the most precisely ordered and controlled system he could conceive of, who genuinely believed that God had entrusted him with a capacity for making money, and that he was obligated to return it to the world in the most useful form possible, and who was simply constitutionally unable to offer his brother what his brother actually needed, which was not money and not a salary, continued in secret and not a monument in a cemetery, but the kind of presence that cannot be reduced to a transaction and cannot be managed like a ledger entry. A man who attended the funeral of the brother who had refused his presence on his deathbed and stood there, by every account, looking tired and careworn. A man who was buried in the same cemetery as the brother he had outlived by 20 years, in the plot from which that brother had removed his own dead children rather than share it. That version also contains genuine truth. Neither version alone is sufficient. Both are required. What the record shows, and what the record does not soften or explain away, is the arithmetic of the relationship. Frank enlisted at 16 and fought at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and Lookout Mountain, and came home with 2 wounds. John stayed in Cleveland and paid a substitute $300 and built the platform from which he would control 90% of American oil. Frank asked for $75 and was refused. Frank testified in Congress about his brother's methods and was kept on the payroll for 14 more years. Frank moved his dead children from a cemetery plot. Frank refused the last offer of reconciliation his surviving brother brought him. Frank used his final breath to issue a formal public statement ensuring that John could not come near him, even as he lay dying. And John D. Rockefeller, the man who gave away $500 million, who funded the eradication of hookworm, who endowed Spelman College and the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University, who built institutions that continue to serve humanity, a century after his death, stood at the graveside of the brother who had refused him and was described by the press that had covered him for half a century as looking tired and careworn. The question this story leaves open is not whether John was good or evil. Both of those things are too simple for what he was. The question is whether the kind of total control he chose to exercise over everything around him, the control that made the fortune and built the institutions and reorganized the American economy around his own position within it, was compatible with the kind of presence that a brother requires. The evidence is at Lakeview Cemetery. The 2 burial sections, a few hundred feet apart, tell you what that question's answer turned out to be. John D. Rockefeller gave away $500 million. He could not give his brother $75. That is the whole story. That is the only story, and it is worth every minute of the time it takes to tell it. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of it surprised you most.